Have everybody with us. Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Silberman. I'm the Director of Education at Beth Tzedek, and it's great to resume our learning with our Day Trips in Jewish History program presented, as always, by Hana Werner. Thank you to generous support in memory of Cantor Joseph Cooper for helping us with this program. And it's great to have you all joining us on Zoom. This is a session where you are more than welcome to open up your microphone and ask questions, to use the raise hand feature to ask questions. You don't have to be silent and off camera the whole time by any means. Just generally speaking around Zoom, if you don't have anything to contribute in the moment, though, please do keep your sound on mute so that if there's any inadvertent background noise that comes up, it won't disturb the presentation either. So our spring series is focused on revolutionary thinkers and practitioners that led to the continued resilience and survival of the Jewish people. Today's conversation will be focused on Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is the earliest of the five chronologically that we're going to be talking about over these next 6 weeks, because remember, we'll take a break for Victoria Day Monday. With that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Hana for what I'm sure will, as is always the case with her, be a very enlightening presentation.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I want to tell you that it's actually relevant, and it perhaps always is, to look at a period in history, and I'm inviting you to come with me today. Let's start, as I like to do with all my classes, with a prayer for the state of Israel. Avinu Shebashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'goalo. Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, Hagen aleha be'evrat chasdecha, ufros aleha sukat shlomecha, ושלח אורך ואמיתך לראשיה, שריה ויועציה, ותקנם בעצה טובה מלפניך. חזק את ידי מגיני ארץ קודשנו, והנחילם אלוהינו ישועה ועטרת ניצחון תעטרם, ונתת שלום בארץ, ושמחת עולם ליושביה, ונאמר אמן. First and foremost, I want to welcome everyone back to another, I think, a very exciting trip. We're going to Jerusalem today. It's a day trip, like many others, just an eye-opener. And so for us, it's very easy to go to Jerusalem. It's easy, and it's actually an opportunity to see Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, more or less, 2,000 years ago. What was happening? And what was it that, once again, people were demonstrating? You know, sometimes when we're learning, there's so much that's it's relevant. Of course, it's different, but very worthwhile. And Rabbi Sachs reminds us, to defend a civilization, you need education. And I think that this is what it's all about. We're going to look at a man called Yochanan ben Zakkai and his visionary and revolutionary thinking. And we will also enjoy the fact that another brilliant Jewish man, who's actually viewed as a traitor, his name was Josephus. Not originally he was Yosef ben Matityahu, and he was a military general in the war against the Romans. Eventually, he becomes the most important historian of those days, and it's because of his history books that we have so much information about those days. One of them I'm holding right here. It's called Josephus, the Jewish War. Who's the world power in those days? And who's watching what's happening in Little Judea, or all of Palestine that it was called then? The Romans are very, very powerful. Their army is incredibly strong and well trained. And our people have made a decision to fight against the mighty Roman Empire. And the whole world is watching. And we are looking into Jerusalem to find out What is the mood? What's happening there? Let me tell you that it's all very political, although, we're going to look at it as a time of great destruction, but great rebuilding. Very, very political. As always, there is a peace party who says, no, let's not fight against the enemy because we'll lose. There is, on the other side, a very, very zealous party. And they say, no way, we'll never give in to the Romans. So there is a lot of loyalty on either side. In between, we have the parties we've heard about, the Pharisees, and they are generally the people who believe in the oral law, first of all, and of course the written law. The Sadducees are the people who have a lot to lose because many of them are Kohanim and great, generally rich people, and they've been very welcoming to the Romans. What do we see here? What are we learning today? We're learning, as we see in all the history books that I've looked at, the nation was divided. Was it 3 groups? Was it 4 groups? There was, as we say, the worldly, the powerful Sadducees, okay? The religious and very, very popular, they're called Pharisees. And there are others, they're called Essenes. They've actually left for the area of the Dead Sea. You've heard about them because they're called the Qumran community around, and we know a lot about them because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Pharisees themselves are divided. Oh my goodness, these divisions. And under the Roman rule, the great Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish court, has been disbanded. So you can see how much is relevant here. There is a problem because some people were very unhappy that there is a war against the Romans. As I said, they are the world power. And because the whole world is looking to see what's happening in little Palestine, there is going to be a concerted effort to send in the most important Roman general, and his name is Vespasian. He's the one who's going to be sent in because Rome cannot afford to allow little Palestine to overcome the great Roman Empire. So when they do, and they're coming in from the north, they are coming in with their usual, or perhaps even more than their usual ruthlessness and their bloody business, because there are massacres and an enormous amount of cruelty. Let's just review what happens in those days before we even look into the Jerusalem scene. In those days, when prisoners were captured, the ones that are not useful would be killed, and the other ones would be sold in the markets of slavery all around the area. In other words, slave markets, that's where the Romans would definitely get. By the way, sometimes there were slave dealers who followed the Roman army in order to simply purchase these slaves. And that's the other problem. Jews end up as slaves. Those that cannot continue to live are dying because of the famine in the cities that are fortified. Of course, Jerusalem is the biggest city that is fortified. And you're already getting the picture that there is going to be a disaster. Now, let me remind you, there are those people who feel, no way, God is going to protect the temple. This is the time of the second temple. We're looking up, what are we looking at? The time frame is approximately 68, 69 of the Common Era. 68, 69 of the Common Era, it means that the Romans are very powerful and the Judeans have made a decision. It's better to fight, and after all, God will protect his temple. Let me just remind you, did God protect the first temple? It doesn't work that way, but there is a messianic frenzy, and that is one of the problems. There are masses who are swept along with this idea, and there are others who are saying, let's join the peace party, and they're afraid to actually acknowledge that they really believe that peace is the only way. Peace means giving in to the Romans, right? So there's hopelessly divided. Let's just find out how we know so much. Who is Josephus Flavius? He was, in fact, the only eyewitness to those fateful years. He himself was educated in Rome. And when he comes back, he wants to pursue a military career, and he's going to become the commander of the forces in the Galilee northern part. He will become the commander of the forces. And you and I know that the Romans are going to come in with thousands and thousands, in fact, hundreds of thousands. I understand from my reading that there were 70,000 Roman soldiers that were brought in order to subdue this little country. So Josephus, who lost his war in the north, in the Galilee, was captured, and he was brought in before the great general Vespasian. Believe it or not, the two of them become very, very friendly, and Vespasian allows Josephus, gives him permission to accompany the Roman forces during the siege of Jerusalem, thereby giving Josephus, or often called Josephus Flavius, the opportunity to write a history, and that's what he does, the history of the war. And his book is called The Jewish War. He has a very good understanding of what's going on in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, what's taking over is the famine. We are told that sometimes this civil war created such animosity that sometimes the one side would literally burn the food that was accumulated by the other side. Josephus, because he moved over or was friendly with the Romans, was labeled a traitor. But he's the only one that has the opportunity to write an eyewitness history. And so we do rely on him. The other book that he's written is The Antiquities of the Jews. And so these are valuable volumes in existence, and they are talking about the early part, well, actually the end of the Second Temple, and that's the early part of the first century. Unfortunately, Jews themselves have created a civil war. What does that mean? It means that even though the Romans cannot come into the city, they have observed that Jews are killing other Jews. In the middle of all that, there's a gentleman, a scholar, a visionary leader who has decided that he's got a different kind of a plan. He's got a revolutionary idea because he's part of the peace party, and he happens to have a nephew, and his nephew is actually a leader in the other party, but he tells him, he brings him in and he says to him, I need a plan. I want to be able to leave Jerusalem. But as you know, I can't just leave. I need a plan. And his wonderful nephew suggests that he's going to tell his students that he's sick. In other words, the students will go out and say, our great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is sick. And eventually, and all of that, by the way, is told to us in the Talmud. That's very interesting story. Eventually, Yochanan ben Zakkai is declared dead, and his students put him into a coffin. What's the plan? The plan is to take this coffin out of the city and eventually bring Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great scholar, to confront, or at least to have an audience with the great General Vespasian. Just imagine, Yochanan ben Zakkai is laid inside a coffin which is closed, and they come to the gate of the city. And of course, the people at the gate do not want to open the doors, but they do the gate, and they do. Who's walking in the front? Well, Abba Sikra walked in the front, and he, as I just told you before, is a powerful man. He is, in fact, one of the leaders of the revolt, and he's willing to walk in the front of the coffin. When they come to the gate and they eventually prevail upon the the guards to open the door, his students bring him to the cemetery outside of the city walls. At that point, they go back, and Yochanan ben Zakkai gets out of the coffin. He will seek an audience with Vespasian. Vespasian is quite pleased to meet him because they know a lot about what's going on inside, and they know that Yochanan ben Zakkai is part of the peace party. And these politics are really just, remember that the siege is going on for a very long time, and there's no way that the Romans can break the walls. There's just, it's a vicious, as war really is. And the Romans are quite interested about all of this, that a Jew has risked his life. Now remember that there is nothing simple about that. What is his plan, and why does he think this is worth risking your life? Yochanan ben Zakkai has decided that there's no way that the Jewish little Palestine can survive, and that eventually the temple will be destroyed. In the meantime, how do you rescue Judaism? What is it that he can do? And he's made a decision. By the way, what he does is very interesting. He greets Vespasian as the future emperor of Rome. And he does that. He's very, very shrewd. He has heard, not social media, but he's heard that Nero has committed suicide, and there's nobody who's actually staying in the position of the Roman emperor, and that Vespasian, being a very strong general, will be the one who will be named the next Roman emperor. And so as he greets him, Vespasian is quite intrigued about all of that, and says to him, is there a request? What would you like to request? Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I'd like to have Yavne, or sometimes called Jamnia, if you're looking it up, and its scholars. What does that mean? What Yochanan ben Zakkai would like to do is take this little town, it's west of Jerusalem and a little bit closer to the seashore of the Mediterranean, and set up an academy. Thereby, his plan is to rescue Judaism, knowing very well that the temple there's no way that the Jews can save the temple. And what must be done is to look ahead. This is what very often we talk about, double vision. Look at the present and then look ahead and see what can be done to save Judaism. After all, there's a big crisis, there's a civil war, and as we said before, a lot of Jews are going to be scattered all over the place, both as slaves, and others, of course, will be killed. So Judaism is in a period of great, great crises. What can be done? For Yochanan ben Zakkai, as a visionary leader who really wants to inspire those remaining scholars with his idea of how to transform Judaism. It's no longer going to be a Judaism that is based on the temple rituals with sacrifices. There won't be a temple, not for a while. The second temple, he is convinced, will be destroyed. And what can we do to bring Judaism in a way that will speak to the people who are questioning? What are the big questions? Is the covenant still part of our lives? Is God going to abandon us? Are we still the chosen people? How are we going to maintain Judaism without a temple, without the center of religion in Jerusalem? Can this new academy that Yochanan ben Zakkai is establishing, can that become a Jerusalem? No. It's going to become an academy of learning. And when there's a question as to how this will maintain the Jewish way of life, Yochanan ben Zakkai and his scholars are ready. Maintain the rituals, maintain our heritage and our tradition, wherever Jews will be dispersed, and they will be dispersed all over, because they will be taken away, as I said to you, to many slave markets. By the way, what was established at that time, and that was for generations in the future, when Jews are sold as slaves, it is imperative, it's a mitzvah, to find the funds to buy those Jews, or to what we call pidyon shvuim, to ransom the captives. That was one of the ways to bring back Jews. The fear, the greatest fear of all, is that Jews will be dispersed in various communities. They will have absolutely no sense of their identity. They will lose their sense of identity. They will lose the way of life. And therefore, Judaism, without a state, without a Sanhedrin, it will eventually disappear. Yochanan ben Zakkai is doing something daring and revolutionary and amazing. He is saying we will transform this biblical Judaism that is based on sacrifices and the temple. We will transform that into rabbinic Judaism. And he looks at this and understands that that kind of Judaism can survive without a country or wherever Jewish people will be. Remember that way back, it was established that every single week, 3 times a week, the Torah will be read on Monday, on Thursday, and on Shabbat. That will continue. Prayer services will continue. Sacrifices will not. What will take the place of sacrifices? Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, what will take the place? Deeds of loving kindness. And that's what we see in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed. The world, that is the Jewish world, is established on 3 major pillars. Al HaTorah, meaning Torah study, learning. Al HaAvodah, which is not about sacrifices, it is about prayer, Avodah Shebalev. And number 3 is Gmilut Chasadim, and those are deeds of loving kindness. And it is most interesting that our discussion today is, as we look ahead at the reading, the Torah reading, which is Kedoshim, one of them, Acharei Mot and Kedoshim, Kedoshim being a parasha that talks about how we treat one another. Very, very interesting, because what we've seen as we're looking at Jerusalem in those days is a time of enormous hatred. And the Torah said you must not hate your brother in your heart. You will love your fellow, whoever, your neighbor, as yourself. This is the time that we're talking about in our history, 2,000 years ago, more or less, when Jewish independence was no longer, not even a dream, because everyone had been really suffering as a result of this terrible division among the Jews. Being divided is always dangerous. When we are divided, we are weak. When we are united, we have great strength. And what it says is, since Rome was so powerful, and because those armies were well trained, there's no way that Judaism could have been saved in Jerusalem, but it can be saved outside of Jerusalem. Even though, as my book says, the Jews, Rabbi Sachs says, the Jews had immense fighting spirit. What they lacked in weapons, they more than made up for in morale and determination. But what doomed the enterprise, says Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, was internal disagreement. And Josephus, who really was an eyewitness to these events, draws a vivid picture of the life within the besieged capital. Now, let's understand, what is a siege? A siege is a time when a lot of people come into Jerusalem thinking it's safer. But what really happens? Eventually, famine takes over. And as we said, terrible, terrible civil war. When the Jews were more intent on fighting one another than fighting the Romans outside the walls, we know that that's the biggest tragedy. And the Talmud says that Jerusalem was destroyed only because of sinat chinam, which means baseless, unbelievable hatred for one another. The internal conflict between the Jews caused the temple to be destroyed. And so when the temple went up in flames, by then, Yochanan ben Zakkai had established himself in a place called Yavne or Jamnia, established an academy. He established an atmosphere of learning, so much so that later on, Rabban Gamliel, who goes from different Jewish communities, says to the people, the Jewish people that he meets, send your children, your boys to Yavne, to learn with the great scholars of the day. So, what's really happening? What it really does say to us, historically, we would say that the Jews had been defeated by the Romans, and that's true. Inwardly, they knew that they had defeated themselves. And that's why civil war is so scary. There's no way that anyone wins. So Rabban Yochanan had these secret negotiations with a Roman general. Imagine the risk, imagine the thinking out of the box, that he makes a decision that it's worth it to go out, even if it means losing his life. Of course, for Vespasian, this was a joke. Give me this little sleepy town. He says, sure, you can have it. What he did, what Yochanan did, was to restore and strengthen the whole idea of leadership in a different place, in a different capacity. He was called the Nasi. He was, in fact, kind of a representative of the Jewish people in dealing with the Romans. he became a little bit like, if you like, I don't know that he was like a king, but he was a Nasi, which today the word Nasi is used for president, the Nasi. What Rabbi Yochanan then understood is that it's learning and the Torah that will eventually help us survive as a people, when a lot of other people thought we had no chance. Let me tell you a couple of things that Rabbi Telushkin says in his wonderful book, his Jewish Literacy, and I think it's amazing to me. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai didn't go for any of the mystical thinking. It says, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai allowed no such mystical thinking to intrude on life and death decisions. And he once advised, if you should happen to be holding a sapling in your hand when they tell you that the Messiah has arrived, what should you do? First, plant the sapling, and then you can go out and greet the Messiah. Interesting. As far as many people were concerned, God had deserted them. Not Rabban Yochanan. Why? He was too busy establishing a new center of Jewish life in Yavne. And when a disciple expressed despair that the temple destruction made it impossible to bring a sacrifice to atone for a sin, Rabban Yochanan said, don't worry, my son, don't be grieved. We have another atonement, and that is deeds or acts of loving kindness, gmilut chasadim, as God says, and he quoted from Hosea, for I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Remember that a lot of prophets had spoken against sacrifices for a long time because a lot of it was not sincere. In any case, let's continue to see what Rabbi Telushkin says about Yochanan's academy, his academy in Yavne. Academy of Jewish Learning soon became a worthy successor to the Sanhedrin that we had in Jerusalem more than any other figure. He must be credited with establishing a model of a Judaism that could survive without a temple, without sacrifices, and even without a country. That in itself is simply marvelous because what he's doing is extending the Torah that was given at Har Sinai. He's extending that to Yavne, where people can experience God's presence in a different way. And through learning, we all do. We all actually experience that. There's some questions that we want to discuss, but we also want just a glimpse of what Josephus says in his book. Josephus wrote a book. Well, I don't know that it was in the form of a book in those days, but here's what he wrote. Every town was seething with turmoil and civil war. And soon as the Romans gave them a breathing space, they turned their hands against each other. And it says, between advocates of war and lovers of peace, there was a fierce quarrel. First of all, in the home family unity, home family unity was disrupted, and the nearest kinsman severed the ties of blood because there was what we would call tribalism. They were fragmented and they didn't see how important it is to have the unity. And so it says that they began by one and all plundering their neighbors, forming themselves into companies that all over the country, so that the lawless brutality, the Romans were no worse than the victim's own countrymen. In fact, those who were stripped bare thought it's far preferable to be captured by the Romans. I shudder to think of how desperate they became, knowing that it's a no-win situation. There is nothing that they can win here. And it's really, really frightening. I'd like to be able to share with you another couple of ideas and of course get some of your feedback because it's really very, very important to realize that when we speak about that, there were other times in our history later on when civil war was averted. The civil war, we do see that in our Bible as well. That civil war is devastating on all sides. It says that Judaism, that Yochanan ben Zakkai gave Judaism a new life as its soul flickered in the besieged city. He understood the fact that when the Romans will be finished, there'll be very little to save. But new ideas define Jewish history. New ideas form and transform Jewish history. We've seen that many times. And I think that that's why, as we look at it today, we are the people of the covenant. We continue to celebrate exactly that. And I think that throughout the history, we've realized that zealots are we know that eventually at the end of that war, remember a lot of people, about under 1,000, came into a place called Masada, and they in fact committed suicide because they refused to fall into the hands of the Romans. And what did we say? Never again. What did Yochanan ben Zakkai do? He deserted the war effort. Was he a traitor? Do you think he was a traitor? Some people thought so, just like some people thought that Josephus was and is a traitor. Yochanan ben Zakkai was in fact the savior of Judaism, transforming a Judaism into a portable Judaism. It can go wherever, and it's here in Toronto. It is a portable religion. He was an intellectual among the Pharisees. Just to remind you, the Pharisees are alive and well. We are Pharisees. We are rabbinic Jews. The Sadducees eventually disappear. There's no temple, and that tended to be their way of making a living. So the Pharisees are us. The Essenes, as far as we know, were also the Essenes. The Dead Sea Scroll area was overrun by the Romans, and they have disappeared. So what we have today is biblical Judaism. I know we're divided. I know that, but it's biblical Judaism, and that is what we celebrate. So when you become obsessed with an idea, as a leader, you are willing to risk everything and realize that leadership requires fresh thinking. Ideally, you can motivate and you can inspire. And we're told that that's what Rabban Yochanan did so well. He had some very illustrious rabbis that were part of his academy. And he was a man who understood that praise, inspiration, motivation, all of that is important in order to build up this community. And so he would say, for example, about his disciples, he would say about their individual strengths. For example, he said about Eliezer ben Hyrcanus that he never loses a drop. What does that mean, he never loses a drop? That means that he has a remarkable memory. And that was his way of really praising realistically the wonderful skill of Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who was one of his great students. About another man, he said, Elazar ben Arach, he said, he is like an ever-flowing spring. And that is another analogy saying he is very creative. His thinking is creative. So we're told that Yochanan ben Zakkai had the talent of really acknowledging the wonderful attributes that people had. And he's a builder. What kind of a builder would you say he is? To me, he's a nation builder. He's actually a builder of a community of learners, people who can learn, and after they learn, they have the ability to then teach as well. What my book says is that Yochanan ben Zakkai became obsessed with the idea that he must found a Jewish academy, which would carry the torch of Jewish learning to the Jews everywhere who were dispersed throughout the Hellenic Roman world. And for that, of course, he was willing to risk everything. And therefore, what do we understand? Inside Jerusalem, eventually people mourned that the temple was burning. The Romans had thrown a torch onto the temple. Outside of Jerusalem, in a place called Yavne, the scholars stopped and they did mourn, but then they moved on with Jewish learning and giving people a new understanding of the wonderful heritage that we have from Moshe. It includes our Torah, and as I said, when we look at Parashat Kedoshim, and it is so filled with 51 mitzvot about how we need to treat one another. And because, even more so, because we saw what had happened inside Jerusalem, the hatred, the civil war of actually killing, we are that much more inspired by the mitzvot that we see in Parashat Kedoshim. Can we once again aspire to be holy? The Torah says yes. And what's important is how we treat one another, because we have a responsibility. We are responsible one for the other. How was that manifested in those days? Because of the tragedy, as I said before, people were told, you have an opportunity to ransom those captives, you must do it. It's not a choice, it's something that you have to do. There are some questions that are important, but I just want to say one more thing before I ask those questions. It was, in fact, in the year 69 that the Roman Senate offered the throne to Vespasian. So you can see that Yochanan ben Zakkai had a calculation there and understood what will happen or what can happen. And so here are some of the questions that we need to ask. And they apply today as they did in those days. Remember that what we learn is totally applicable, transferable to what we see today. In his book, Jews, God, and History, the author is saying this. In the world around them, the Jews were scattered. How does one go about preventing the disappearance of a people which has lost his country and which has been fragmented into thousands of segments, and which has been strewn over vast land masses amidst all kinds of alien people and religions? What measures does one take to preserve the identity of such a people? Remember that whatever we're saying today about those days applies today as well. How do we strengthen the identity of people who are scattered in every corner of the world? How does one enforce such measures when there is no political power, which at that time, no police and no army? What were the dangers which Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and his successors foresaw? The danger of Jews disappearing. How? Many of them were slaves. They couldn't keep up their Judaism as slaves. Many of them were forgetting the language. How will they maintain the whole idea of davening and learning? The danger of the Jews forgetting and forsaking their heritage. The danger of the Jews of being overwhelmed by the majority. And as we know, that happens today as well, and there is assimilation today as well. So these are key questions to ask, and they are applicable today as well. And of course, we have a lot of concerns about life in general. How will we maintain a strong Jewish community? Yochanan ben Zakkai started, maybe he started small, but his thinking was to defend a civilization, you need education. And what is he defending? He's defending the civilization of Judaism and the rich, rich Torah that we have. So I'd like to tell you that because he cared so deeply, he was able to act courageously. And he was, as I said, developing a double vision. Today, it looks like that, but here's what I think will be. He says, our Judaism will be transformed into rabbinic Judaism based on the Torah, but so much more, the oral law. And what did we say? The oral law is what we have today in the form of the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Gemara. And Rabbi Telushkin continues to tell us that even without a temple, and we know that, but we have a third temple, we call that the state of Israel. We could survive without sacrifices, and we have for 2,000 years. And of course, in a sense, we have that Mount Sinai that moves to the diaspora. Every synagogue represents a holy space, as sacred spaces, if you like. That's a better way to explain it. And so was he realistic? Was it reality for him? He said, I can, I must. And so he did what he did, and we cannot but admire him, because he had that kind of foresight to know that Judaism will survive if we care about one another. That is what we will read on Shabbat. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. So survival is always a concern. That is a Jewish concern, has been for a long time. Survival of Judaism. Today too, in those days for sure, Jews were scattered all over because of that terrible war. And what is the danger? That they will disappear. That Jews will disappear. We know better today, don't we? That regardless where there is Judaism, and a little synagogue grows up and becomes a big synagogue. When Jews live among all kinds of alien cultures, Jews have to work that much harder to maintain our heritage, our rich heritage. So how would you preserve the identity of the Jews? We're still struggling with that as well, because it's very important to be proud Jews. How would you enforce rituals and holidays? How would you do that? Well, here's what happened. Whereas at one time, the Kohanim were very powerful, and they were the ones who worked in the temple and had great authority. What happens after this, the time of Yochanan ben Zakkai, is that rabbinic Judaism becomes so important that a man like Rabbi Akiva will grow up later on from a family of converts, illiterate, until the age of 40. But remember, in those days, we become aware that the crown of Torah can be a crown that everyone can attain. Even Akiva, who was simply simply a shepherd, until this beautiful Rachel recognized that he has the ability to become a scholar and sent him to study. That is, she married him on that condition. What do we understand? That a person can become a great scholar, admired by many, even if he was not from a distinguished family, and certainly not a rich man, because I don't know if you know the story, but Rachel said to her father, I really want to marry this shepherd. He was incensed. You're not going to do that. That was his only daughter, Rachel. How could you do that? I will cut you off. You will not get any of my money. And Rachel makes that sacrifice. So Rachel becomes the wife of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva goes and learns, and he becomes the great, great scholar. Of course, Rachel's father will one day meet Rabbi Akiva and realize how fortunate it is that this great rabbi is, in fact, his son-in-law. So it sounds very romantic. It does. But what it really is telling us that there is a democracy. What does that mean? If you were born into a family of Kohanim, then you can be a Kohen. But in order to become a scholar, a great rabbi, you can be born into any family, as long as you're willing to learn and study. That's what happened with Rabbinic Judaism. And we are Rabbinic Jews. That's what we are. And so as I close, I'd like to just ask another couple of questions and hope that you will also have some comments. So what we are looking at is that there is dangerous thinking. The dangerous thinking, unfortunately, is that people suddenly think God is going to come in and do some, what we see in the Torah, 10 plagues, drown the Egyptians in the Red Sea. The time of the Second Temple and the First Temple was not like that at all. Jews are responsible. We have a responsibility for our own destiny. And so it's dangerous to think, as this messianic frenzy and all, whatever we call it, the frenzy in general is, the enemy is powerful, and that's the reality. So they asked what happened to the covenant. Well, 2,000 years later, we know that the covenant is alive and well, wherever it is that we live. And what about the idea of being a chosen people? That too continues. In a marvelous way, this was, if you like, a new and improved Judaism. Every person has a responsibility, and Jewish concepts continue to fashion or to really define our way of life. Shabbat continues to be Shabbat, and holidays continue to enrich our lives, and learning, as I often say, is really the cornerstone of Jewish continuity, and therefore everyone can become a leader. It's powerful, very powerful, that learning is empowering. It is an empowering way to continue our rich tradition, our heritage. Is it realistic? Can we rebuild? And the answer is absolutely. It's realistic to rebuild the life of the Jewish community wherever, and to have very strong connection to Jews wherever they are, because we are one people, and to continue to uphold and support the state of Israel. I'd like to thank you and find out what you're going to add, because I'm sure there are lots of, it's not only questions, but, speeches, comments.
Thank you, Hannah. Everyone is welcome to open up your microphone and or your camera. If you'd prefer to also write a question in the chat, you're welcome to use that as well.
Wow.
Where am I? I have a question or a comment that may lead into a question. Presently, the situation in Israel is there is thought that there may be a civil war in Israel right now, basically because of the legal system. And I like to think that much of the legal system has a religious or Torah-bound source to the laws, but I cannot see how, let's say, Yochanan would handle it if he was here today. How's that?
Wow. So I think that the good news that we hear from Israel, and it's certainly not going to be a political lecture, the good news that we hear is that yes, there are demonstrations, and yes, people are divided, and it's not that simple to find a solution, at least what we see. But one thing is clear: there is no violence. There's no violence. There's a love of country, and there's a love of what the people have been building for 75 years. Because Israel is about to celebrate this week the 75th anniversary, which is really monumental. And there have been, and we can even touch upon that, threats of civil war. Certainly the time of the Altalena, which is the boat that came in to the shores on the shores of the Mediterranean, and there was some shooting, but Menachem Begin said there's no shooting because he knew that civil war must be averted at any cost. There was a time, when Jewish people, the leadership in Israel in the early 50s had terrible, terrible disagreement. But there was no civil war, and that disagreement had to do with accepting reparations from the Germans. The reparations were accepted by the head of the government, David Ben-Gurion, and he made it very clear that those reparations need to be accepted as not for the dead lives. There's no way you can ever do that, but for resettling a lot of the Holocaust survivors in Israel. You needed to have the money to stand on your feet because Israel was accepting and bringing in so hundreds of thousands of Jews, and also to make up for some of the possessions that had been stolen. But it was in no way, and I just have to tell you that it was a very difficult time, according to our books, that Menachem Begin said, absolutely not. David Ben-Gurion said, yes, we must. And you can see how close that was to a time of terrible, terrible, terrible disunity. But once again, Jews understood that it's not going to lead to civil war. We see civil war in the time of way, way back in the biblical time, but these are modern times. And people need to know when you've reached the limit, the red line, and you cannot cross it. And so what we see today is an enormous sense of love for the country. And even though there are demonstrations for and against, and that this is problematic, clearly nothing simplistic about it. Nevertheless, even though there's always a danger, Yochanan ben Zakkai would have preached exactly what I tried to describe. First of all, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And deeds of loving kindness means that that one is responsible one for the other, as we see in the Torah, and not to stoop to the level of people who think that that's a way to solve problems. He made that very clear. That's why he left Jerusalem. If he thought he had a chance of changing what was in Jerusalem, he would not have left it. He was well aware of the dynamics and how fragmented, and the fact that there was this sense that zealots are taking over, that is discouraged by Judaism. To be realistic means to accept the fact that we are passionate about our own point of view, and that passion, we are passionate for Judaism. What they were doing is passionate against. Each life is sacred. What they were doing was forgetting that. We are told to love the stranger, not only your neighbor. Love the stranger, love your neighbor. That means a Jewish responsibility. And one of the things I could tell you in addition is leaders need to have the ability to see the big picture, to see more than we see. We meaning me. They need to see the big picture and what can be salvaged, what can be transformed. How will we turn the page and move on? It remains to be seen what will take place in Israel. But above all, and relying on a very astute observer of the reality on the ground in Israel, he explains carefully that number one, there's no violence. Number two, there's no plundering. Nobody's plundering, nobody's violent. Everyone understands that ultimately we may not love each other and we might not have a hard time respecting, but we love and respect our country. So ultimately, everyone there is loving Zionism, loving the state of Israel. And that's why I'm so optimistic that it will eventually come to something that is positive and good.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Anyone else? No? And so let me tell you that because I think it's very easy to label people. And as I mentioned to you about Josephus, and there's a note that you'd like to, yeah, Daniel, is someone sending us a note that I should comment on?
Oh, no, my question was, are there accompanying notes to this lecture series? Because it was a lot of dates and it was a lot of heavy history, so I like to read it at my leisure.
Oh, okay. Can I recommend a couple of very good books to you?
Yes, please, ma'am.
Yes, okay. So the book that I love to use on many topics, and there's a wonderful couple of pages about Yochanan ben Zakkai and of course Rabbi Akiva and the whole idea of the Second Temple, is called Jewish Literacy by Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. Let me spell Telushkin. T-E-L, T like Tom, E-L-U-S-H-K-I-N.
Thank you.
It's a kind of little book. Sorry, it's a big book, but every topic is addressed. Plus, at the end of these 2 pages, there will be sources that you can look for further. The other one is an old one. Of course, Rabbi Sachs is always part of my the books that I like to consult. But there's another old book that is talking beautifully about this topic. And the name of that book is Jews, God, and History. Jews, God, and History. A very good resource book. The name of the author is Max Diamond. Let me spell Diamond for you. like David, I-M-O-N-T, like Tom. Max, diamond. Not like diamond, but diamond. Jews, God, and History by Max Diamond with an O-N-T. That's correct.
I've put it in the chat.
Thank you. A
Titles.
very, very useful book to consult. And in addition to that, and I really would want you to know that there's a wonderful book by Rabbi Greenberg. Should you want to have one more resource, it's called The Jewish Way, and he looks at many different holidays. It's an excellent, excellent assessment of all kinds of situations in our Jewish history. I love it. And so what he says, and I'll finish with Rabbi Greenberg. Rabbi Greenberg says, Rabban Yochanan's response to the destruction of the temple was extend learning to as wide a group as possible. Does that sound like it's 2,000 years old, or does it sound like it was explained yesterday? Rabbi Greenberg is saying that his response to that, and he knew the temple would be destroyed, is extending learning to as wide a group as possible. And that's why really I'm so delighted that you've joined me today, because this kind of learning, it can be heavy, really worth seeing how important it is that throughout our history, we've had leaders who've transformed, who have really helped us think differently. Just think differently. And so it says, if you learned a lot of Torah, that gives you a sense of identity, and it really makes, here's what he says, Torah study would verbally recreate the destroyed world of the Jews. All Jews. And so that's what it says in our Torah. We can be Mamlechet Kohanim and Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests, people who are literate, people who are knowledgeable, people who seek more learning, right? And in participating in all of that, it says here that we are unfolding the covenantal way by being informed, by seeking a strong identity and a proud sense of being Jewish. So for him, that is Rabbi Greenberg, he's saying that about this event of destruction, we learn from that hatred of one another is destructive. And therefore, we recommend not sinat chinam, but ahavat chinam, meaning that we have an opportunity to embrace one another and to speak kindly to one another. So ultimately, what are we doing? Redirecting our understanding of the rich, rich heritage that we have as Jews, a wonderful heritage. So is that the new normal? For them, it was, and for us, we often look at how we can strengthen our sense of being proud here and at the same time supporting communities of Judaism everywhere. And that's what we do. That is the blessing that we have. Can I thank everyone for joining me today, and thank Daniel. Daniel, would you like to announce the coming Monday?
Be happy to do that. Just give me a moment to pull it up. Next Monday, under the very capable hands of our ritual director, Lauren Hennick, because I will be in Israel next week on a professional development opportunity, which is wonderful.
Wow, wow, I'm so excited
that's
for
great.
you.
Which of course means I won't be here to be able to hear Hana, but I can always watch the recording, which, by the way, we'll send out to all of you as well. And so to Rose's question, if there's anything you wish to go over in any more detail, you can find it there. Next week, we will be looking at Israel ben Eliezer, who you might know by his more popular name, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism in the early 18th century in Eastern Europe. and sort of how his new vision of Jewish living was both a response to a tragedy in a way, and also very novel in its own right. So that will be next week, and we will continue making our way forward in the historical timeline in the weeks to follow.
So we'll end, as we always do, with a prayer for the Chayalim, for Tzahal. מי שברך אבותינו, אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא הגנה לישראל, ואנשי כוחות הביטחון, העומדים על משמר ארצנו וערי אלוהינו. מגבול הלבנון ועד מדבר מצרים, ומן הים הגדול עד לבוא הערבה ביבשה, באוויר ובים. ייתן אדוני את אויבינו הקמים עלינו, ניגפים לפניהם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ישמור ויציל את חיילינו מכל צרה וצוקה, מכל נגע ומחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם. ידבר שונאינו תחתיהם, ויתרם בכתר ישועה ועטרת ניצחון. ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כי אדוני אלוהיכם ההולך עמכם, להילחם לכם עם אויביכם, להושיע אתכם, ונאמר אמן.
Amen.
Thank you to everyone who joined us today. See you next week. תודה.